Well, good day, everyone. Thank you and welcome for joining. Thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Tomorrow is going to mark the end of the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP27, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Of course, this year's conference comes amid a very unique set of circumstances, most especially Russia's war in Ukraine, which has had a disruptive effect, obviously, and impact on the global energy and food security, contributed to soaring inflation. Also, the notable deterioration in relations between the largest emitters of greenhouse gases, the United States and China, the latter of which continues to have economic growth compromised by its zero COVID policy, which is depressing both demand for energy and having a depressing impact as well on price conditions, which could change quite dramatically next year in both cases. And while this was meant to be the implementation COP, if you will, to sort of practically build on the ambitions of COP26 and to ensure the integrity of corporate net zero pledges, given that this year is the first COP since 2016 to take place in Africa, attention has also naturally turned to the impact on those countries that have done the least cause climate change, but are certainly likely to suffer the greatest consequences, both economic and humanitarian. And that, of course, led to the controversial topic of loss and damage, which was also a dominant theme at this year's conference, particularly in week one. And perhaps most sobering of all, a week before COP started, the United Nations Environment Program issued a new report saying that there was, quote, no credible pathway to limiting global temperature increases to that all-important 1.5 degrees Celsius. So here today to discuss this year's COP, the takeaways, and what it means for corporate actors, I'm joined by two experts in their respective fields. Pia Heidenmark Cook was the Chief Sustainability Officer for IKEA, where she led the development and implementation of the IKEA People and Planet Positive Strategy, developing circular business models, including take-back offers, leasing and secondhand, and launching new sustainable offers such as selling solar panels in 14 markets. During her tenure, IKEA ranked in the top 3 most sustainable brands globally, managed to decouple CO2 emissions from its commercial growth. Today, in addition to a number of non-executive board roles, Pia is a Teneo Senior Advisor, and she works with our ESG and sustainability teams, and she joins us today from Sweden. Phillip Cornell is Principal for Energy and Sustainability at Economist Impact. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, where, among other things, he focuses on sustainable energy transition, policy, and critical energy infrastructure protection. Previously, he was a senior corporate planning officer and advisor to the chairman and CEO of Saudi Aramco, and a special advisor to the executive director of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, and he joins today from Washington, D.C. So thank you both for joining. And Phillip, I'd like to start with you, I think, here, considering you've just returned from Sharm, and give us your impressions of COP27. What was your experience there this year, and what were the highlights?
Sure. Well, first, thanks a lot for having me here, Kevin. It's great to join you and to talk a little bit about this COP. I think sort of, as you mentioned, this came on the heels of COP26 last year, where we saw really a raft of pledges on the part of both companies and corporations toward net zero. And so, we're looking forward to this was supposed to be the beginning of this decade of implementation. And that was certainly the theme of COP27. Coupled with the fact, that this was held in Africa. And so as we think about implementing, what we need to do to get to those pledges and fulfill the ambitions that were set out in COP26, I think now both companies and countries are starting to come to grips with the costs that are going to be required, particularly upfront costs to achieve the energy transition. And given that this is being held in Africa, how those costs are balanced was really a major theme. So this issue of equity, both across rich countries and developing countries in terms of who should bear the cost burden, was certainly an issue. But I think that there was also, a greater, that concept goes beyond just countries, also to within societies. So this question that as we sort of those costs become apparent, particularly in the context of, as you mentioned, an energy crisis, inflation that's driving a cost of living crisis in many countries, this issue of extra costs, which might be associated with energy transition, even if the current inflation and crisis isn't a direct result of those policies, it still reflects what can happen if we mismanage the amount of investment that might have to happen, for example, in traditional energy sources versus advanced or new alternative energy sources. And so that question of who pays is not just one among countries, but also within societies, and thinking about, okay, who needs to bear the cost burden, and over what kind of period of time. So, a lot of the conversations that we heard, and the Economist and Economist Impact were, as you mentioned, present at COP for the first week with a series of events and also meetings. We had a lot of talk with our clients and with partners, both public sector and private sector. This issue of equity kept coming up. And also because it was themed about Africa, there was also this issue of adaptation. So as you mentioned, there's a recognition that the window, at least on the more ambitious 1.5 degree target of warming above pre-industrial levels, is closing. And indeed, at The Economist, our climate issue was released last week to coincide with the opening of COP, made a similar argument that in fact 1.5 degrees looks unachievable at this point, which doesn't mean that we need to take our eyes off the ball of mitigation, but it means that we need to start to recognize what are the impacts, how to deal with adaptation, and that's really about how we pay for and deal with the results of climate change, which are already being felt around the world. And that was really a message that we heard from African colleagues over and over again, particularly in places like the agriculture sector, which accounts for something like 50% of the African labor force. So with each small increase in temperature, already you see very significant impacts, particularly on smallhold farmers that are really at the mercy of weather changes and weather pattern changes. So this issue of adaptation really came up. And in fact, when we saw the World Leaders Summit at the beginning of last week, there was the release of the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, which was really moving adaptation to the front and center of the UNFCCC agenda and the national agenda. So I think that was a big issue. And I think the second theme beyond equity that we really saw over and over again was on the corporate side. So as I mentioned, a lot of these companies made very significant net zero pledges and then are now confronted with how to actually get there. There has been a big interest, obviously, for the past couple of years in ESG, environmental, social, and governance aspects in terms of determining corporate value. And there was, particularly at the time that these pledges were being made, sort of an understanding that not only was this the right thing to do, but there was opportunity in this transition towards sustainable corporate practices. And I think now the focus is on, okay, how do we actually recognize, conceive of, and potentially measure what that potential corporate value creation really is, even if it's over a long period of time, which might be beyond, let's say, traditional measures of shareholder returns, but still trying to figure out how do we move it from a sort of very conceptual idea of value creation and a lot of talk to something where we can actually measure this and integrate it with established corporate practices. So, within companies, there was a lot of talk about how you move the strategy from, let's say, the chief marketing officer, where it might have sat 10 years ago, through to the creation of new chief sustainability officers, which have proliferated over the last 5 to 10 years, but have very different roles depending on the organization, to, let's say, concrete corporate planning under, for example, the CFO and the CEO. So all these questions about how do you move it to the center of corporate planning and accounting, and how that actually plays through to sustainable finance. So, at COP27, for example, we also saw the release from the ISSB, which is the International Sustainable Standards Board, which was sort of created to at the last COP, at COP26 in Glasgow, to consolidate a lot of the reporting frameworks that companies have to contend with when they think about sustainability initiatives. So I think those two sides, the equity side and adaptation that's linked to the fact that it was in Africa, and also this corporate approach and how we actually put meat on the bones of implementation on the corporate side, which I'm also really looking forward to hear what my colleague Pia has to say about this, because that action.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. I mean, and we'll bring Pia into this conversation in a moment to particularly unpack on this corporate front. But I wanted to ask you just a couple of follow-up questions, if I may. One is, I'm going to betray the fact that the preponderance of our, most of our audience is U.S. based. I'm sitting here in New York, of course, and I know when you go to any kind of a conference along these lines, it obviously feels like you're in the center of the universe. But of course, this year, this came in the middle of the U.S. midterm elections. We've got the G20 this week. We've got the ongoing news coming out of the war, et cetera, et cetera. And sort of in the absence of, unlike, say, COP27, where you had some of these very big announcements and pledges and whatnot, this was a little bit more, it was a little bit less with these big announcements. And as a result, the event kind of got relegated to some degree to back pages and, later minutes in news broadcasts. What was the mood there? I mean, considering some of these sobering assessments that came out right before, and the backtracking that has been caused by the war and by the ongoing impact of the pandemic and the like, what was the general mood of the delegates and participants?
Sure. Well, I mean, as you said, going into this COP, I think COPs in general that go from year to year are sort of the outcomes are sort of a function of where it sits in the UNFCCC agenda, as well as what is the surrounding economic and environment and the discussion that's going on around climate. So I think going into this one, as you mentioned, especially coming off the heels of COP26, which was significant in terms of updating countries' nationally determined contributions, so their pledges to make climate change, how they were going to make sort of implement climate change agenda. I think we expected that this was going to be quieter on that sort of official front. As you mentioned, we didn't expect some of the big pledges, but the fact that we're in the middle of a serious energy crisis and on the cusp of recession, at least in a lot of developed world countries going into 2023, and that the impacts of that crisis are being felt around the world, particularly in developing countries, where access to, let's say, liquefied natural gas is being siphoned to Europe to meet supply shortfall there as a result of Russia. This is really being felt around the world. And so that question of how this is impacting the developing world, how we need to think about financing to advance transition in the developing world, and how we need to think about, as I return to this question about equity, how that sort of adaptation side of things are also financed, and what is the support of richer countries, was really a recurring theme. So, we saw that very much in terms of the reaction to a lot of developed countries' leaders who were there, particularly in the first week. And as you mentioned, because there were midterm elections going on, President Biden only showed up at the end of the week after the midterms were over, and arrived touting rightfully a lot of the legislative victories that have happened in the U.S. Over the past year, and particularly the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, which gives something like $400 billion to clean energy. It's one of the largest clean energy packages in American history, and really incentivizes the scaling of things like hydrogen, clean transport, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and a whole host of clean energy technologies. But when he arrived to make that announcement, there was a lot of frustration and anger at the lack of progress or lack of announcements from the U.S. and other developed countries regarding transfer of finance to developing countries to deal with the impacts of climate change, or to the cost of energy crisis, which is hitting some of the poorest people in some of the poorest countries the hardest. So I think that sort of frustration with particularly around ramping up fossil fuel use in the context of crisis in Europe, so turning on coal plants, siphoning in more liquefied natural gas, talking about major investments, at least in the short to medium term, in fossil fuel. The hypocrisy of pursuing that while they have consistently been discouraging fossil fuel investments in developing countries to fuel their industrialization or development. That was an ongoing sort of underlying feeling, I think, around a lot of the COP. So these issues of equity were really front and center.
Okay, so I want to turn to Pia here in just one moment, but you've been dancing around a subject here in a lot of your commentary. I want to turn to it because I think it also may need, for the layperson, a little bit of a description and explanation, and that is this concept of loss and damage. And the demands and the arguments that were made about that at COP, and frankly in the broader discussion on the climate and energy transition issue. So maybe, Phil, can you just spell it out a little bit for us, and for those who are less familiar with the concept, and then where that went, and what ideas are actually on the table as far as loss and damage.
Sure. So the concept of loss and damage has been around for a while. I mean, at least since the Paris Agreement and before. And really, what it's referring to is the liability of rich countries, or those countries that have already been the source of emissions over the past century and over the course of industrialization that have led to climate change such as it is now, their liability to countries that are feeling the effects of that climate change. And so while this has been sort of touted for many years, this was the first year that it was brought front and center into the negotiations and proposed that official concepts of liability, payment schedules, and payment the size of payments be sort of officially integrated into the COP process. And this was pushed, obviously from a lot of developing countries, but found a lot of sympathy and support among a cadre of developed countries, particularly in continental Europe. And so we saw, we saw pledges. The fact that they made pledges was significant, even if the dollar amounts weren't massive, from a lot of continental European countries, thinking about countries like Austria and others, who sort of took the side that this is relevant. But there's a lot of resistance, and I would say notably from countries like the US and the UK, to the idea of officially granting or admitting to that kind of liability. And I think that this plays into a longer or sort of a wider movement that we're seeing about liability to polluters for climate change, which is not just at the national level, but is sort of slowly becoming a reality in several jurisdictions. Notably, last year in a Dutch court case against Shell, there was sort of a number that was actually put on in terms of liability that is required by that company for the climate change that it's caused in the past. So this is part of a much larger trend that's starting to point to polluters and historical polluters and really hold them accountable in a financial sense. But you can see why the sort of breaching of that concept can lead down a long road of potentially expensive liability, which is why, at least in the conceptual moment now, you saw resistance from some of the largest polluters, and that was, recognized, I think, at the conference. And I mentioned sort of the reaction to President Biden, but similarly to the British Prime Minister, that this skirting around that issue was one that couldn't continue, given how central it is to the conversation today.
So Pia, before we turn to the ramifications for the corporate sector, I'd love to hear your reaction to what I know you weren't at Sharm yourself, but clearly you've been observing from where you sit, and indeed, just sort of picking up on what Philip was talking about, you sit in Europe. It's been amazing after all of the battles over the taxonomy for dealing with the energy transition and sustainability over the last several years. So how quickly certain energy types suddenly became green very quickly this year, and how those squares are being circled. But what were your sort of observations and takeaways from this year's COP, or any reaction you have to what Phillip's just laid out there?
No, thank you, Kevin, and happy to be here. And just to add a bit to what Phillip said, because I fully agree with everything said. I think one thing, much fewer CEOs at this COP than last year, but still quite a lot of practitioners, CSOs. So I think there's this discussion around, I mean, COP is there for negotiations and for policy and for us to kind of multilaterally agree between countries. But it's also ended up being this kind of showcase and the kind of corporate event. And less so, of course, this year than in Glasgow, but still a lot, with also a lot of kind of anti-climate lobby being in the room. So just a reflection on who's there, why are they there, and what's the outcome of all the side events. So that's one reflection. The other one is, again, more on the corporate side, but the consequences of all this. So if it's a good COP or a bad COP, and of course a good COP is if we get agreements and we move forward. That is in a way maybe harder for some companies because, again, you sit with even more legislation and policy coming. On the other hand, you also get a clearer playing field, because I think what we saw with inflation and the stock market in the last few months, I mean, uncertainty is the worst. So the more we're kind of going back and forward and not really knowing what's the framework that I need to act within, it's harder for companies. So I'm hoping that, there's still a few hours left of negotiation, that we will get something out there. And then from a corporate perspective, of course, there are opportunities and, of course, the risks and costs, both in adaptation and in mitigation. But overall, we need to still focus on mitigation. And of course, a lot of companies have committed to net zero by 2050 or hopefully 2040 and earlier. So no matter if we feel that the 1.5 degree, and I need to stress, it's not a goal, it's a limit where we have said that for life on Earth to be as little uncomfortable as possible for us as human beings, 1.5 is the wished limit that we want to stay at. And a lot of companies have made commitments according to that, and those remain. So I think we need to still work towards that as companies and as the corporate sector.
Just going back to something you said a moment ago, I wanted to pick at this a little bit. What did it tell you? I mean, on the one hand, you mentioned there were fewer CEOs there, and they sent their proxies, more of the CSOs or what have you there. What did that tell you? But also, my understanding is that compared to previous COPs, the sort of the hydrocarbons lobby was more heavily represented at this one. Certain activists like Greta Thunberg decided not to attend, basically, an implicit criticism of what COP had become. How do you interpret all of that? The who was there, who wasn't there element?
Yeah, it's a good question, Kevin. I mean, I believe in dialogue, and I believe that the only way to move forward is that we actually do come to the table, and we need to find ways of deep listening and really understanding where the other side comes from. I can fully understand Greta from where she comes from. It is a bit worrying when it's becoming more of a corporate event to show off what we're doing, or closing corporate deals. And so it's the place to be if you want to meet your peers and close corporate deals. It is a bit unfortunate because that's not what it's intended for. It is, for countries to meet and agree and move the global agenda forward. But on the other hand, to go back to the early COPs where it was just ministers and officials and only about policy and not the corporate world is not the way to go either, because we cannot achieve 1.5 without the corporate sector. I mean, that's where the most money is, and the kind of economic power sits in the corporate world, but also the reason why we have climate change is because companies are producing things, using oil and gas to produce things that we can use. So we need the corporate sector at the table, both in terms of they are part of the problem, they need to be accountable for what they are producing, but also to help show the way forward. So I think those CEOs and CSOs that were there, despite everything going on at home, I mean, they're super busy doing other things than climate change right now, does show that this is a corporate C-suite topic and you need to address it, and we need a way forward. So I think it is important that we're there showing that, we made a commitment, we are working with implementation. It is very difficult. I mean, the whole equity cost question is a dilemma also within the company, with the kind of dilemma of short-termism and more mid to long-term decisions. So I think it is really important that we have the corporate sector there.
So on this point, though, so we're in a situation now where fully a third of the 2,000 largest companies in terms of revenue around the world have publicly stated net zero goals. But over 90% of them are not on track to actually meet them. And here we are in a world now where we're facing rising rates, inflation. Basically, the era of free money is coming to an end, and the sort of the house money that everybody was playing with a rocketing stock market. Those days are coming to an end. It's going to be, and as Phillip pointed out, I mean, there's upfront cost associated with all of this. So, how do we deal with this? And I want to get to the specifics of IKEA in a moment, but I know there's certain unique elements of that make that a great example, but not a great example in many ways. But just in general terms, how do we get companies to implement and keep the commitments that they've been making over these years in this more challenging environment for them?
Yeah, I mean, we've had it easy. I mean, I was talking to some CEOs that were in their early 30s a few weeks ago, and you realize that more or less their entire adult life, it's been relatively easy in terms of war and peace and in terms of access to money. And so it's going to be harder. But once you made a decision, and I think that is a key thing, that as long as we see sustainability or net zero as a nice to have, and I do it when I can afford it, and if it's good for my purpose and my brand, otherwise I'll do other things, then you end up in that dilemma. But once you kind of fully committed as an organization and it's part of your business planning, it's part of what you do, then you just need to find the way forward. And I think a lot of companies have made commitments in the last 2-3 years without maybe fully understanding the roadmap for how to get to net zero, and are now, unfortunately, then in this kind of crunch time when access to capital is harder, realizing that it actually means changing business models, it means changing potentially the products you're selling, the way you do your business. And it's a lot of hard work. And then you kind of need that kind of settling and reflecting on, okay, this is not going to be an easy journey, but it's a thing we have to do. And I think there's something, let's see if I get the quote right, but my husband is Canadian, so I have these kind of hockey quotes, but Wayne Gretzky said that, go where the puck is going. And we kind of know for certainty that we're not getting less climate change. So by waiting, you'll just get more policy, more legislation, more fines, more lawsuits. So a general rule is maybe you don't want to be the first one and be ahead of the pack by too far, but you also don't want to be the laggard where you're so out of date with all the demands that are going to come from employees, from customers, from legislators, from investors. So kind of need to just get in there, be pragmatic, and really reflect on what are the things we can do short term, what are the things that will we'll maybe have to wait a bit and do in 5-10 years, but it's making that plan and getting it into your business plan and being serious about it. This is about management, setting your goals, following up on your goals, assuring your goals. And it is about leadership, being clear. We have decided, we are sticking to this. It's going to be maybe much harder than we thought, but we have to do it.
And Kevin, maybe I can just follow up on that a little bit, because Pia has said some really great things, I think, both about the private sector at COP and the imperative for private sector organizations. I think she's exactly right that, this is not just about sort of confronting potential risks, or maybe it's a nice have. It's about sort of the imperative for companies to address potential risks in their business and in the wider economic environment that are also associated with, let's say, climate change in terms of the effects of climate change on their portfolio, which is why this has been led by very large asset owners and managers over the past couple of years that have really pushed this forward and put pressure on boards within their portfolio companies to move forward. So I mean, it's a real calculation of effects on their portfolio, but also I would say both at a country level and at a company level, this energy crisis has really highlighted the risks of reliance on things like fossil fuel imports. I mean, if you look at companies inside Germany today, we're seeing a raft of bankruptcies that are caused directly as a result of very high energy inputs. And in fact, those companies that had engaged in, let's say, more renewable energy or energy efficiency were actually better cushioned against the effects of crisis. So we're seeing that it's not just about sort of a wide esoteric benefit over a very long term, but there's a concrete impact on business. And I think that if we look to sort of the role of companies at COP, particularly what drove them to make such big ambitious commitments ahead of Glasgow last year, that was a big part of the puzzle. And I would point also on the financial side, where you saw some very large financial alliances like the GFANZ, which is the Global Financial Alliance on Net Zero, or things like the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which represent enormous institutions. I mean, $130 trillion in assets, things like that, which look like a lot. But again, when they come to somewhere like COP, there is this, I think, lingering suspicion of greenwashing, and there continues to be, trying to see concretely what those alliances are doing. And so at this COP, I think that happened again, where there was, for example, a report from Share Action that said, well, something like 80% of the Net Zero Banking Alliance members have one sector-specific target. Very few of them have set interim targets that cover financed emissions in all sectors. So there's a lot, even though they represent a lot of money, we have to look at what actually is being spent and how tight are the measures and how strict are the measures that they have for stopping their members from bankrolling companies that are linked to emissions or to things like deforestation. So there is, I think, even though we're seeing a lot more corporate action and corporate representation at the COPs, there is I think the danger or the risk that this becomes something like a trade show and sidelines, particularly some of the most important stakeholders on the civil society and activism side, that might feel that this is, corporate representation is drowning out their voice, even though, as Pia said, the money has to come from the private sector. I mean, John Kerry made a comment that no government has the kind of cash that's necessary or the resources to solve the energy transition or climate crisis alone. And so we need to think about real ways to incentivize and motivate private sector financing around these issues.
So just going back to what both of you have now just been talking about, it sort of begs the question of ESG, right? And I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole as a subject matter all unto itself, but clearly ESG, which has been the sort of a buzzword of the last several years, has been under some degree of attack, partially because of the changing market and economic conditions that companies and managements and boards are going to be facing for the first time in a long time. But also this sort of that's one element. The second element is this perhaps kind of ESG 2.0 kind of concept that perhaps the elements of ESG need to sort of be more disaggregated. Some are more easily quantified or objective. Others are tougher. And then a third, of course, is the pushback against ESG. I mean, you know, quite frankly, here in the United States, Republicans have just taken control of the House. They're going to have investigatory power now. We know that there has been pushback on the likes of people like Larry Fink at BlackRock, who have been pushing for an ESG agenda, and there's this kind of pushback on wokeism, if you will. How is that playing out at COP specifically on this concept of ESG and where we're going to go? And I'd love to hear Pia's take on this as well. But maybe if there were some initial observations you had from Sharm itself, Phillip.
Sure. Well, I think that's exactly right, that there's a feeling of political pressure, particularly in a few American states that have made very concrete punishments or consequences for companies that seem to disfavor, let's say, one kind of energy source or another. But overall, I think the commitment remains there. When you talk about disaggregating, sure, I think there's a lot of talk that says, the climate aspect of the the environmental, and particularly carbon emissions, are sort of in a different category than the rest because, they're relatively easily measurable. We can sort of fall under the same frameworks and how we account for those emissions. There's been a lot of progress also on the technical side in terms of creating more transparency within value chains and among suppliers. So there is a real sort of concrete element to this, whereas on the S and even on the G, we see a lot more sort of regional variation, interpretation of what is good social practice or what is good governance in a company. But either way, companies have to deal with this because their shareholders demand it, right? So as companies go into proxy season, we can see the amount of sort of shareholder activism or shareholder proposals around these different issues. And again, they're not going away. In fact, last year, the Economist Impact, we've done some study on looking at those proxy seasons, and we see that particularly on the S side, a big uptick in the last couple of years. Now, are those focused in, let's say, West Coast technology companies where perhaps shareholders and employees might embrace more of sort of what you call the woke side of the spectrum, perhaps. But all around the world, we're seeing companies that are under pressure from their boards and from their shareholders to address this. So I don't think it's going away because it's not something that's being imposed from the top down. It's really something that we're seeing an appetite for from consumers, from stakeholders, from employees, and from shareholders. It just might look different in different parts of the world.
Yeah, Pia, I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, no, so many reflections to sort out where to start. I think one thing with everything going on is we still do live in an open world where we are interdependent on each other. So no matter what happens in the US, there also happens a lot of things in Europe, a lot of things in Asia, and most companies or large companies are multinationals. So they are impacted with the changes in the EU taxonomy and upcoming other legislation in Europe, where you have your extended supply chain and you need to look at it, no matter if you're in a state where there's another opinion right now. So that's one reflection, that it is here to stay, and you can't just look local. You need to just think global. Another one is, I think it's good that there is some pushback on ESG in the sense of we need to become more professional. There's been too many different guidelines, too many different ways of doing things, and we need consistency because it is about measuring and following up, and we need to make it easy. It's from a corporate perspective, crazy when you have 500 different supplier questionnaires, and they're all asking kind of the same thing but a bit different, and you're hiring people to fill in questionnaires. That's not what we want to achieve. So I think we need that professionalism. On the other hand, there's also pushback because I think the more successful the climate movement and the activists are, and the more you come to the core of the matter, which is we need to change the way we do business, of course there will be a pushback because if you're not successful, no one cares what you're doing. You can just kind of keep playing in your little corner. So I think it's quite natural that this pushback comes now. One, we need to professionalize, but also because some people are worried about what's going on. And then my kind of last, maybe not so politically correct comment is, being European, I find it interesting when people are upset about certain fuel types being disfavored when we have been favoring or disfavoring renewable energy, solar and wind for decades, or at least for decades. And that was okay. So why is it not okay now when we know that one actually hurts the planet and people's livelihoods, and the other one actually doesn't to the same extent? So, it's in the eye of the beholder, but I find that a bit interesting.
Yeah, and maybe I can just follow on that, because I think this is a really key issue. There's certainly, especially in today's political environment in places like the US or the UK, something of a cultural political aspect. But there's also, I think, a real economic question here, which is, as we look at the energy transition continuing, again, the risks of simply disinvesting or divesting from what are seen as, quote, dirty fuels, or companies that are sort of maligned because of what's, because of the fuels maybe that they're working with. In the absence of sufficient scaling of alternatives, the result is potentially, continued crisis and price volatility that really does impact affordability in developed countries and developing countries. And I think the risk here is, as we can already see sort of the deleterious effects of inflation on politics. And I think the risk is that if those costs, of that volatility and price spikes end up falling on individuals, that from a political perspective, we might lose support or get a backlash against the entire transition process. So, while we are trying to continue this transition, the getting from here to there, let's say the future of a net zero economy will be more affordable, will be more secure, will be less exposed to fuel volatility. It's a better world, but the transition in between here and there risks being messy, and the mismatches which are inherent in such a huge orchestration of a shift of the economy are inherently going to lead to losers, and is going to lead to volatility that impacts people. So that's the role of policy, to sort of smooth that transition. But I think just taking a, and we hear this line, I heard it at COP, stop oil now is a big movement in the UK, or divesting directly from any fossil fuels. I think that as we see the product of energy crisis, that there has to be a sort of balanced approach. But the faster we go, the better it'll be for everyone.
I think we're definitely.
Yeah, mitigation. Sorry, Kevin, but mitigation is cheaper than adaptation. So, and there's so many reports on that. So, but I agree. It needs to be managed, the transition, because we don't want complete social unrest and revolution, because then that's not going to be in the favor of anyone. But there's something in being clear on where we're heading, and also painting the picture of how not nice it will be also for those who are kind of feeling like they have something to lose in this new world. We're all going to be impacted, no matter, high income, low income, everyone. And of course, unfortunately, those with the thin wallets are the most impacted. But I think we need to just, I agree, we can't close everything and just switch tomorrow. But if we had started, and you can't kind of in hindsight, but, IKEA started to invest in renewable energy in 2009. It was much more expensive per kilowatt hour then to get the wind and the sun than it is now. But I'm quite sure that by us starting to invest then, put us in a much better place now. And it also makes us less vulnerable to fluctuating energy prices. And there are other companies, like Ørsted, that just completely changed their model from fossil to renewables. So it is possible, but you need that kind of consistent, this is where we need to go, and make a roadmap and kind of, cushion it as much as possible and take care of everyone. But we can't still be debating if we need to do the transition or not, because we have to.
So this is a perfect segue, and Pia, this is the first time you've been introduced to our audience on this. So I have to take advantage of the fact that you're here today to talk a little bit about IKEA itself, and how you and your colleagues got to that exalted level in terms of being so highly rated on the sustainability front. Because let's be honest, here's a company that sources stuff from around the world. You're shipping product around the world, and and honestly, every college kid around the world's dorm room is filled with stuff that they feel is essentially disposable furniture. So how did you get there, essentially? And how much of that is a function of being a Scandinavian company, Swedish company, number one, and number two, controlled by an enlightened foundation representing the founding family, as opposed to institutional shareholders or what have you? How much of that was an impact? And if I could, now that you're stepped away from IKEA and you are advising companies that are not based in Scandinavia and are public companies who are who didn't start back in the late 90s or early 2000s and are having to catch up from today's starting point, how are you advising them?
I think, of course, it contributed and helped and made it easier for IKEA to be kind of rooted in Scandinavia with the values of nature and equality, and that's kind of how IKEA has grown up in its last 75 years. So it helped, and not being listed, having the quarterly has also helped. On the other hand, IKEA is a retailer, which means that every product that doesn't get out of the shelf that day is a lost product. So retail is short term, and it is kind of weekly sales figures or hourly sales figures. So there is definitely a short-termism in retail, even though you're not a listed company. So I think what maybe was the kind of key thing was culture, the kind of corporate culture where cost consciousness is critical as part of the values and has always been, because you can't be for the people with thin wallets without it. And sustainability is a lot about being efficient with resources and being smart. So kind of understanding that, and that comes from the founding Ingvar Kamprad. Having that understanding, seeing the connection between the two definitely helped. I think also in the culture is this understanding the impact and the responsibility you have when you are a big brand. IKEA is by no means perfect. There's been lots of issues throughout the history where, we haven't been perfect. The difference sometimes is that we haven't been sending in the corporate PR team to kind of make it look good and fix it. But, they have, of course, done the crisis management, the crisis communication, but there's also been operational teams going in saying, okay, we need to really understand what's going on and how can we change and how can we kind of adjust and make it better. So I think there's been a lot of that genuine wish to do good, and that comes from the vision of creating a better everyday life for the many people. So there's that genuine in the company. Yes, we sell a lot of disposable furniture, but we're also contributing to people with thin wallets having a beautiful home, which should be for everyone, shouldn't just be for a few. So I think there's that genuine wish to do good, and that has helped. Then what we did, and what I think companies today maybe have a more challenge is we spend a lot of time on insight, building the case, talking about it, which was harder 10, 15 years ago because no one else talked about it. Easier today for companies that are starting today. But the benefit IKEA had was, of course, we could make a few mistakes because there were not that many talking about it. And there wasn't that many investors, activists, customers, employees shouting for it. So I think companies today, you kind of need to set the plan or the goals and the plan and kind of execute it while you're kind of learning. And I'm getting that from some of the clients and boards I sit on where people are leaning in, maybe more than IKEA started 10, 15 years ago. People, and I mean employees and customers, they want it, but they don't really know what it is. So they're saying, I'm with you, but tell me what to do, because my mind is on so many other things. But the sustainability team can't really tell you what to do because we haven't done it before. So we need to do it together. And I think that is, from a corporate perspective and a change management perspective, one of the most difficult things in this is that we've kind of almost ended up in a world where I go to work and I do the things I'm told to do. But we need to think, we need to reflect, we need to be entrepreneurs, innovators, creative thinkers, and challenge, because that's the only way we can make this happen, because we need to paint this world where we're heading, and we need to find all the solutions on getting there without really knowing what it is. And that is difficult. But I think once you crack it, you have more fun, because again, you kind of tap into that creativity that I think we actually like as people, and you get that kind of feeling of being part of something that is bigger and better than just kind of here and now and celebrating that the sales results were great.
So we have a few minutes left, and I want to turn to both of you on I guess my question here is there an incentive out there for to sort of never emphasize the good news on this front, because lest it create a sense of complacency, and then everybody says, okay, we're on the right track, so let's go focus on something. Because it occurs to me that and I think it was in the Economist itself, Philip, several years ago, former President Obama wrote in there, and he was lamenting the fact that climate change sort of happens too slowly, in a sense, right? Particularly in a world that is guided by quarterly earnings results and a 2-year congressional election cycle, let's say, in the U.S. And in July of this year, the New York Times published a poll that suggested that only 1% of voters saw climate change as the most important issue facing the country. And even amongst voters under 30, that number was only 3%. And yet, there have been some phenomenal strides, which both of you have been talking about here today. And sort of, Pia, I mentioned when I was introducing you earlier, that you had decoupled, emissions from revenue growth at IKEA. And indeed, we've got dozens of countries now that have decoupled economic growth from growth in CO2 emissions, and every dollar of GDP in richer countries is requiring fewer emissions to produce. So there's been some really good news. So I guess maybe we can end on here on the high note, or how do we balance that, Pia?
It's a really good question. I would agree with Obama in the sense that it's one of these big problems that we don't see enough of. And I was just asking my teenage daughter, don't you talk about climate change in school? And of course they do. They, way more than we did when we were in school. But it's still often in the science topic, whereas sustainability and climate, it's social science, it's economics, it's marketing, it's everything. But we're still kind of talking about it as a science topic. And I think talking about it, creating the links, understanding that this is fundamentally about how we build societies and how we build companies. We just need to keep making those links and connections. And I think we're on a good way, but that is not talking just about the great stories or all the negative stories. It's really just painting that picture and connecting the dots. And I think that's what we need to keep doing, so people see that this is about how we choose to live on this planet. It's that big. So I think that's the kind of key thing. To keep talking about it, keep making connections, and painting the picture of where we're heading.
Yeah, Philip. I mean, is there too much negativity out there, and a sense of fatalism sort of sets in, or has entrepreneurism and human ingenuity and the right kind of public-private partnerships actually presenting considerable opportunity? In some ways, this has got to be considered the biggest business opportunity of all time to get this right, both at a state level and at an individual company level.
Yeah. Well, first, I think you're exactly right that this conversation can lend itself to some pretty morbid, issues of crisis. That the planet is dying and that people are potentially dying as a result. And the fact is, that it's not decades and decades away. I mean, we're seeing, famines that are going on in the Horn of Africa today, disasters around the world that certainly have an impact. So I think that there is that kind of mitigating serious risk of what our environment looks like, which is an issue. But I think, you're also right that crisis fatigue is real, and, bombarding people, constituents with constant crisis is not always the most effective. There's huge opportunity in this change. The biggest, as you said, sort of economic transformation and opportunity, at least since the Industrial Revolution, again, to quote John Kerry from last year. So what's exciting here, again, are those opportunities that you can find in your business and in your daily life as a result of more sustainable activity. And I'll just, use the case, for example, of local pollution, where transfers away from coal plants have significantly lowered, disease and expanded lifespans in cities around the world where that transition has happened. First to gas in places like Tokyo and London and Europe, but also today as we shut down coal plants in favor of renewable energy because it's simply cheaper. And so the business opportunity, in things as technology marches forward and as cost curves go down, are really significant. I mean, renewable energy is just the cheapest greenfield approach to electricity generation in countries that represent over 75% of global GDP at the moment. Those technologies march forward. Another great thing that came out of COP27 is we saw really what are the public-private partnerships that you mentioned to spur innovation. And I'll point, for example, to the First Movers Coalition, for example, that was spearheaded by the U.S. In conjunction with the World Economic Forum, that saw a major expansion at this COP, and that's really about getting companies on board to pledge to use certain technologies, even at a cost premium at the time that they become commercializable, which actually is what spurs continued innovation and investment in that technological improvement. So we're seeing a lot of real opportunity here for business. It's not just about risk. It's not just about risk to your portfolio or regulatory risks, although that is real. Society is moving on and government policy is moving on that will create greater incentives for companies. But I think what we have to see here is we are moving to a better place, a place where energy is cheaper. And that's, again, a message, even in countries like Africa, where they're having to solve an energy access issue. A lot of places where less than 50% of the population has access to electricity. But these kind of technologies and low carbon technologies can actually lower the cost, increase access, particularly if we think about things like off-grid solar, and also bypass dysfunctional utilities that are still dependent on very expensive diesel. The problem is just getting there. And getting there is where we need to be thinking about novel financing approaches and continuing to focus on that equity, so that at the end of the day, we are in a better world where things are cheaper, cleaner, and more secure.
Well, I'm always happy to end these calls on a high note. So I want to thank you both for that. And Pia, I have to tell you, I can't tell you how many of the guests on this show use the skate to where the puck is going quote. It's going to become a drinking game probably pretty soon on this show. But I have to leave it there. So Phillip Cornell and Pia Heidenmark Cook, thank you so much for your time today. This is going to be an ongoing discussion, obviously, as we move forward in this uncertain world. So thank you both for joining. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Until the next edition of Teneo Insights, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.